The United States is increasingly focusing on deeper engagement with Africa, and under the Trump administration, trade has been prioritized over aid. This shift aims to strengthen economic ties and partnerships across the continent. As a result, some African countries are positioned to be potential winners in this new approach, but there will also be countries who will lose out. So, to discuss this further, we have Joshua Meservey from the Hudson Institute with us.
Thanks for having me again, Linda.
You, in a post on X, you previously mentioned countries like Uganda, Morocco, Egypt, and Somalia as potential winners due to the Trump administration's policies. Has that list changed since you posted that?
Yeah, I think some of the reasons I chose those countries are still relevant, but obviously there's been some larger developments. I would say tariffs would be the big one here. So when you look at tariffs, at least for the short term, you could argue that pretty much all African countries have been losers from the tariffs because they are subject at least to the 10% baseline tariff, and then others are subject to higher, what the administration would call reciprocal tariffs. Um, so there is that element. But leaving that aside, I think the list that you just mentioned, yeah, I would say they've done a little bit better maybe under the Trump administration so far. This is still, I have to remind myself of this. We're still early on in the administration, so a lot of this, there's no official strategy yet. So on Africa. So we can talk about an approach to Africa, and even that approach is still developing and is nascent. So I don't want to draw any final conclusions on this, but I think yes, with Morocco, the reason I chose Morocco is because during the first Trump administration, the president was supportive of Morocco's position on Western Sahara. That appears to have, or it has continued. The administration, it remains supportive this second time around on this issue that is central to Morocco's foreign policy and domestic policy, for that matter. So a very significant priority for Morocco. Uganda, I chose more because it had had such a difficult time under the Biden administration. So a simple change in administration from the Ugandans' perspective was probably going to be a win. And I do think that's accurate. Where the Trump administration is much less hostile to Uganda than the Biden administration was. Um, so again, I think if you look at the trade situation in that sense, a lot of African countries are facing some pain here. Maybe over the medium or longer term, those trade relationships will get sorted, and maybe it'll be a net benefit at some point. For now, though, I think there is some short term pain here. Um, but if you move away from the trade issue and look at some of these other geopolitical issues, then yeah, uh, some of the countries I think that I selected as potential winners, I think that's held up fairly well, and there's been some potential losers, so to speak, from the Trump administration as well.
Now, how do you think African countries should navigate this? So, the kind of deals that were made with the DRC, is that the way forward? Is that what's going to happen?
Yeah, I think generally yes. So I've in my conversations that I have with African governments and delegations, et cetera, I say you really should, I strongly encourage you because I want better U.S. Africa relations. It's one of my great goals of my professional career. So I think for African countries to take advantage of the opportunity, because there is opportunity here. I've spoken about some of the downsides, but there's absolutely opportunity where the Trump administration is really transactional, and it's a cliche to say it, but there's a reason everybody says it because that happens to be true. So that means that African countries, if they can, as I encourage those I speak with, go through a really thoughtful strategic planning process. Sit down and really think, okay, what do we want from the United States? What can we offer the United States to get what we want? It's just a typical, in some ways, deal. And that's what African countries really, really need to do. I think they need to understand as well, and maybe this has been the biggest barrier, is that we have genuinely entered a new era of an American approach to the continent. Previously, for decades, actually, the U.S. was by far the largest supplier of development assistance, and that was just government, government to government type, or government development assistance from the United States. The private giving from the United States was oftentimes bigger than the official development assistance. So the U.S. has been a massive source of development assistance for decades. Uh, on the government side, that has well and truly changed, and I don't think even when President Trump leaves office, even if Democrats come back into power, I actually don't think it'll go directly back to the status quo ante, maybe ever, because there's just been such a fundamental shift. So African governments really need to acknowledge and integrate into their thinking and planning this new reality, that the United States is not going to go to them and ask for the honor of giving them development assistance. I'm being a little hyperbolic in the way that I framed that, but it it somewhat had that vibe, let's say, previously, where the U.S. would go to African countries and see, how can we help you and can we give you money and etc. No, we're in this new era where African countries will have to go to the United States, come to the United States and say, here's what we can offer you, and here's what we want in return. And I would argue there's some real benefits associated with that. I think, one, it might force some very hard choices from African governments and to do some of the nitty gritty governance type activities that they really have been able to avoid because they can always rely on this development assistance coming from overseas. But it also means a much more equal relationship. If African countries can position themselves as partners that can offer something valuable to the United States, that's a much more equal relationship than being simple supplicants or receivers of aid. That type of relationship is inherently unequal. And for all of the rhetoric, I've heard it for so many years of African countries demanding that they be treated as full partners, and the Americans and the Europeans saying, yes, you're our partners. As long as you are accepting millions and maybe billions of dollars from a country, you will not be their full partner. That's just the reality. So I do think this is a real opportunity, if African governments can seize it, to genuinely reset the relationship into something that's more sustainable, more of a genuine partnership, and ultimately more beneficial potentially for their own countries.
Well, what about the military presence of the U.S.? Because in the Sahel region, they've basically been driven out because of coup d'etats and the governments there. And I see they are looking at bases lower down in southern Africa. So, in that respect, what can we expect from the U.S. government?
Well, interestingly, I think the security concerns, the counterterrorism concerns that the Trump administration has currently regarding Africa are pretty typical of American administrations. So it's radically deviated from previous administrations' approach, even including its own first term approach to Africa, on trade and aid and investment, etc. But on counterterrorism, it's been a fairly typical approach, even more aggressive, I would say, than the Biden administration. So we've seen a significant uptick in strikes, drone strikes, and etc. in especially northern Somalia, but also other parts of Somalia. And that denotes a real concern with Al Shabaab, the very nasty terrorist organization there. Uh, and yes, the U.S. was, after the French got driven out of the Sahel, the U.S. was also booted out of Niger following some coups. But recently, the U.S. ambassador to Niger returned to Niamey. And there's even been some overtures or some talks, let's say, some interactions between Mali, diplomatic interactions between Mali and the United States, because the U.S. And the Trump administration is very concerned about the counterterrorism issues in the Sahel. The Sahel is the epicenter of global terrorism. It hosts a number of highly capable, highly dangerous terrorist organizations. And the reality is that, so Russian forces replace some of that French and American presence and European presence. Other European countries beside the French were there. Um, but the Russians won't be able to put a lid on the terrorism problem in the Sahel. They're really there as a sort of a regime protection program for these coup governments. So when you look at the trajectory and sort of the likely developments in that area, it's very grim. And I think the U.S. And the Trump administration obviously believes that it needs to have a robust counterterror presence in that region, or at the very least have some sort of ISR or intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance presence in that region, because it the U.S. is essentially blind on what's going on in the Sahel, as are many other countries, including some of the African countries themselves, I think. And that's a very dangerous situation because the great one of the great tragic lessons the United States learned from 9/11, I think, is that when you allow some of these terrorist organizations time and space to relax, and uh, if you're not pressuring them constantly, eventually they start thinking about, well, how can they attack the great Satan? How can they attack the United States, either in the American homeland, or how can they just kill Americans in the region, or Westerners, or other people? This has been the pattern of both ISIS and Al Qaeda affiliates for decades now, really, for over a decade, I should say. So uh, that's those are the concerns, I think, regarding counterterrorism. And then maybe northern Mozambique would also be another one where there's a massive gas field that companies from all over the world are invested in, including some American companies. The Rwandans are there trying to push back this very nasty terrorist organization in northern Mozambique. So the Trump administration is obviously, I think, concerned about that issue as well.
Recently, General Langley was replaced. Does that mean any change in approach of the U.S. forces on the ground in Africa?
No, I don't think so. So, the commanding general of AFRICOM isn't really a policy making individual. He's hugely important. I'm not trying to downplay his importance, of course not. Um, but the U.S. military has a very strong ethic of civilian control. It's part of what makes the U.S. As powerful as it is this sort of unimpeachable sense within the U.S. military that they answer to civilians. So it's really civilians who set the policy direction for the U.S. military. Now, again, within that, commanding generals who are very powerful can, of course, do certain things, even significant things, but the overall direction will be set by civilians. So, with General Langley, I believe he's retiring. That means that there will probably be some changes in management style and other things. But I think the general sort of security posture of the United States on the continent will remain as it's been since the Trump administration took power.
Just we can, of course, not talk about, Trump policy and what's happening in Africa without talking about South Africa. So South Africa is clearly one of the countries that is in a total different position after the Trump administration. So when we talk about African countries and their relationships with the administration, we've spoken before about what should Africa do, but where South Africa is now, what should it do? What kind of change in approach would they have to be from the Ramaphosa government?
Yeah, I think it's mostly centers on political questions. I think those are the changes that Washington is looking for from the Ramaphosa government, and uh, it's no secret, I would say, probably what a lot of these are. I know Pretoria confesses confusion sometimes about what the U.S. exactly wants, but I think that's they're either really not paying attention or they're just it's convenient to claim that they're confused. So I can run down the list. The ICJ case is a huge problem. This is lawfare against a major non-NATO ally of the United States. This is a treaty ally, Israel, I'm talking about, of course. This is a treaty ally of the United States. It's also a country that is fighting organizations, including a country, Iran, but also Hamas and Hezbollah, that would happily kill Americans and have killed many Americans in the past. People seem to forget Iran. In 1979, the very first thing they did practically during the revolution was invade the U.S. embassy and hold American diplomats and other Americans, but American diplomats hostage for over a year. That's an act of war in most contexts. Embassies are sovereign territory of the countries that own them. So and it just it went from there. So Iran is a huge problem for the United States and has been for decades. So Israel is fighting Iran, is trying to prevent it from achieving a nuclear weapon, and then it's also fighting Hamas and Hezbollah. So it's a treaty ally. It's fighting our enemies. It is a democracy, the only one in the Middle East. And there's also a large Jewish population in the United States. It's one of the few countries where Jews feel safe. Now, not all Jews support Israel, of course not. There's a broad spectrum of opinion within the Jewish community on Israel, but some do. Many do, I would say. And so there are those strong sort of people-to-people links between the United States and Israel. So I say all that to try to explain why this ICJ case is so problematic for the United States. Because, and then again, particularly when you juxtapose the South African approach to Israel and its approach to Iran, right, where they will say nice thing, General Mapwanya, chief of the South African Defense Forces, was just in Tehran saying all sorts of warm things about the theocratic dictatorship there that is brutal, that disappears people from the streets, murders people, including outside its own borders, etc. And then also, Pretoria has nice things to say about China and its policies in Xinjiang, which the UN has described as ethnic cleansing. It will host General Hemeti, a genocidal leader of a militia in Sudan. And I could go on, right? I'll stop there. But so the hypocrisy is really glaring in Washington on this issue. So they, Pretoria has made their bed, so now they have to lie in it. So, a phrase that we would use in the United States, they've created this situation. They need to figure out how to get out of it. They could, and it's not my place to tell them exactly how, but I would offer some suggestions that maybe they could, take some of the budget. They're spending a lot of money on this case and reallocate it to a more worthwhile cause. They could reassign personnel, etc. There are ways they can de-emphasize, the ICJ case. They could reestablish diplomatic relations with Israel, and then moving on from Israel, they could, stop with the joint military exercises off the coast with Russia and China. The South African Navy is in a terrible state, unfortunately, and so these joint exercises seem mostly designed to give Russia and China operational experience in a sensitive part of the world. They could, again, stop saying nice things about Iran or sending very high level delegations to Iran, to Tehran. And they could stop abstaining or even voting against resolutions at the United Nations that are trying to hold brutal governments like Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, etc., accountable for their human rights abuses. There's a laundry list. I've literally written a report on these things, and other people have given very good advice as well. And then maybe on the economic side, Black economic empowerment laws represent a huge non-tariff trade barrier. So if you are an American company wanting to enter the South African market, you will have to surrender 30% of your operation. That's a massive tax. And this is part of the reason why South Africa received the highest tariffs of any sub-Saharan African country. It got the single highest rate in all of sub-Saharan Africa, and there's only two North African countries that received an equally high rate. That was Algeria and Libya. So they need to figure out how to take down this extraordinary tax and non-tariff trade barrier to American companies. They need to either do carve outs or special economic zones or something. Even SEZs wouldn't be that effective because you're limited to the actual territory of that zone. Um, so again, I think there's a whole host of things that South Africa could do. I really genuinely believe I understand some of these things would be very, very difficult and it would be a process. I think I think Washington would understand that but the US is just looking for something or anything beyond empty rhetoric that South Africa is genuinely willing to take hard decisions and make the types of reforms necessary to resuscitate this relationship. Up till now, there's been no actual substantive changes on these core problems at the heart of the relationship. And I think people are growing hopeless in Washington that there ever could be, um, the types of substantive changes from Pretoria that are necessary.
Well, did it help that, with the case of the head of the defense force in Iran, did it help that the Department of International Relations quickly, said, okay, no, he's wrong? Did that help in any way? You think that's sort of a step towards the right thing, the right diplomatic move to make?
No, I think the opposite actually, because if you read the Durko press release, they did not denounce the substance of Mokwanya's comments. They did not denounce the fact that he was there. They denounced the fact that he had violated bureaucratic protocols by intruding onto Durko's foreign policy prerogatives. And then the presidency also was upset that it didn't know about the trip. It did not, they did not come out and say, we are appalled that the most senior military official in our country has gone to Tehran, a supporter of terrorism all over the world, and has said really nice things about it, and has promised deeper cooperation militarily and political as well. That is not what they said. Um, so they were, and they were upset about the timing because they are in these delicate negotiations with the United States on trade, and so they professed their upset that his visit had come at this time. Again, it wasn't about the substance or that he was there per se. So I thought it was, the Durko statements and the presidency statements actually reinforced this idea that they are not serious about repairing the relationship. They were angry about the optics of it and the bureaucratic transgressions that were, I guess, inherent in the visit.
So, what ideally could be a first step towards better relationships of your list that you mentioned?
Um,
If you had to sit
I-
down with Ramaphosa tomorrow, what would you tell him?
yeah, I would. Well, I think I would tell him that they need to do an assessment um, of this list of grievances the United States has. Which ones can they make substantive progress on quickly? Um, that would be my advice. I don't know because I'm not familiar with the labyrinth of South African bureaucracy, and that's very much for South Africans to decide, and the South African government specifically, obviously, to select which of those issues they could make real substantive progress on, and then they can go to the United States with the trade deal that they've been working on. But I'm frequently at pains to tell people and to emphasize, the trade deal will not get it done. It will not repair the relationship for a couple reasons. One, trade is not at the heart of the problem with the United States. Again, it's these political issues. Two, um, South Africa, any trade deal that South Africa can offer the United States is going to be fairly marginal to the U.S. economy. It's not going to have a significant impact on it. It'll have a significant impact on South Africa, but not on the American economy. So the benefits from a South African trade package and investment package are going to be fairly marginal and not enough for the U.S. government to overlook the political problems. Now, I do think within that there are some things that could be higher value. Cooperation on critical minerals, for instance, because U.S. is obviously massively prioritizing that issue. And the reality is the U.S. Doesn't have many mining companies at all anymore because they've been strangled to death by domestic regulations. So that's an area where South African companies, which and South Africa does have world-class mining companies, could be creative and say, look, we can help you. Here's how we can help you. We can help you in Southern Africa, but we can also help you with your domestic, situation where we help. We do skills transfers. We'll invest in some of your mining, and we can allow you to benefit from the expertise that we've built up over decades. So I do think there's some things on. I don't want to be totally dismissive of the economic element of this because I think there are a few key things or useful things that South Africa could offer, but fundamentally the problem is political. I just always reemphasize that. So any trade and investment deal that makes concessions on pork or chicken or auto parts, it just won't change things.
What about a boots on the ground team that represents a broad part of society, Afrikaners, everything that really intensively can speak literally daily to Washington? Because at the moment, there isn't a team like that.
Yeah, I I think that could be useful. Something I say as well is I know a lot of these delegations that have come to the United States have been controversial in South Africa, but I've met with many of not all of them, but many of them, and I always thought they were doing South Africa a real favor, frankly, because they were in Washington saying, please, don't hit us with tariffs, don't rescind our AGOA access. Yes, they were critical, of course, of the South African government, but I don't think they would have had any credibility in Washington if they were not critical of the South African government. I think everybody would have ignored them and dismissed them. So they were critical, but then they also said, you know, um, we like the United States. South Africa and the U.S. would have a wonderful partnership, and please don't hit us with these tariffs. And again, the GOA rescission, etc. So yes, I think that can be helpful, but this isn't a messaging problem. That's not what's going on here. This is an action problem. Both actions that the South African government has taken in the past and continues to take, again with General Mapwanya being the most recent example, and others that they just have refused to take thus far. Until that changes, I don't think more delegations or even a permanent presence will fundamentally alter the trajectory here that is very negative. But by all means, they should have a really capable ambassador. That I'm not suggesting, that's unimportant. At the very least, so they can have a better understanding of the debates within Washington and the discussions within Washington. But again, it's an action problem, not a messaging problem.
Dr. Meservey, always so lovely speaking to you.
Well, thanks for having me on again, Linda. Enjoyed it.